I hit the record. Oh, okay. So Rabbi, there you go.
Okay, welcome everybody. I am very excited about this series. I want to thank Diane and the Education Committee for reviewing and selecting this topic. We had a lot of good choices and they made their choice. And I am really looking forward to this. We're going to start with our Torah learning blessing, which is the same as the candle lighting blessing, but ends la'asok b'divrei Torah. Let's do it together. Baruch atah Adonai. Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav, v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Thank you to the source of all for inspiring us to immerse ourselves in learning. That is what we are going to do today. We're studying Pirkei Avot, and I want to start by saying something just about the name Pirkei Avot, because you've probably seen it spelled all different ways in English. Of course, it's originally in Hebrew, so it's okay to transliterate it differently. So you will see it spelled Pirkei sometimes, or Pirkay, and there's all sorts of variations. They're all correct. In Hebrew, Pirkei Avot, I'm going to break it down and start with the second word. Avot actually means, most literally, fathers, but it is also the collective word for ancestors. So I like to translate it as ancestors. And Pirkei is translated in a range of ways, from ethics of the ancestors, sayings of the ancestors, wisdom of the ancestors. It means something like that kind of conglomeration of words. So we're basically studying the wisdom of the ancestors. This is also a book or a section of the Mishna. So we're going to start by situating Pirkei Avot, both sort of literarily and historically, and then we're going to dive into its content. Pirkei Avot, Wisdom of the Ancestors, is a chapter in a book of the Mishnah. Now, the Mishnah has 6 orders. This is one of them. Pirkei Avot is a chapter in one order of the Mishnah. And what is the Mishnah? The Mishnah is the first part of the Talmud. It was written about between 0 and 200 CE, so the first couple hundred years of that millennium. So I'll say it again. There are 6 orders of the Mishnah. Pirkei Avot is a chapter in one of the orders. And all of the Mishnah is the first section of the Talmud. So the Talmud continues after the whole 6 orders of the Mishnah are done. Once about 200 CE happened, the Mishnah was codified and finished. But the Talmud continued developing in the Gemara, which is the second big section. So the Talmud consists of the Mishnah, that's the 6 books, and of the Gemara, the continuing commentary on it all. And what the Talmud's basically doing is playing out the rules for Jewish living in the diaspora. That's what the Talmud is. And that took many, many centuries and probably was completed around 600 CE. So Pirkei Avot is a very beloved section of the Mishnah. And we are in good company with Jewish communities all around the world who are going to be studying it between Passover and Shavuot. We're not quite there yet. This is an orientation to get us ready for that kind of traditional study period. But the idea of if you think about it, like at Passover, we're leaving slavery in Egypt, and we're aspiring towards Sinai, the big gathering of freedom and revelation and Torah. And it's a spiritual ascent every single day of that period, which is a 50-day period. And so we study the Mishnah to get more wise during that period. These days, also some Jewish communities study it over the summer leading up to Rosh Hashanah or during the high holy days. So actually it's studied all year round, but especially between Passover and Shavuot. Bobby, let's go back to the community view. I want to see if there's any questions at this point about just situating it so that I can see hands. Anybody? have anything? Okay, and I want to, in this community, we always do visual access sort of early on. So I want to kind of stop for a moment of visual access. In our Zoom room, I think we have something like 26 people. And here I am in my little Zoom station at home, map of the world behind me, embroidered kippah on my head, Mishna in hand. Uh, and I think that's about it for the moment. And really glad to see everybody here. Anybody have any questions so far about sort of where we find the Mishnah and like what is it? Okay, really good. So now we're going to look at the history of kind of what's the era that this is being created in, because it's going to really influence our understanding of these wisdom statements. A lot of people know the story of the Exodus from Egypt. You know that part of our mythic history. There's no real evidence historically that that actually ever took place, but it's a very powerful Jewish liberation story that has probably the biggest, most important freedom story ever anywhere in the world. And I call it mythic history because it's foundational, but it's not exactly historical. And a lot of people know that part of the history. We were slaves in Egypt. We left Egypt. We crossed the Red Sea. We wandered in the desert for 40 years. But what happened after that? So we're going to look at the next 1,000 years after the Exodus, which lead up to the creation of the Mishnah and the texts we are looking at for this series. It's going to be a quick review of those 1,000 years, but a really important part in Jewish history. So we wandered in the desert for the 40 years. Mount Sinai happens, we get the Torah, and we end up on the edge of the land of promise. We need to cross the Jordan River. And does anybody know who lives there at that time? It's not an empty land, it's a populated land. We have to go back and forth from community view to featuring me as the speaker so that I can also see people. Thanks, Bobby. Anybody know who lived in that land of promise when the Israelites, the new Jewish people, arrived at the borders? Anybody know who was there at that time? Okay, well, this part of it is historical, who actually lived there at that time, because there's lots of archaeological studies. They dig down through many, many layers, and they find cultural remnants. They find, it's actually very amazing what they can find. They like to look through middens. Would you know what a midden is? A midden is like a pile of refuse from a settlement that they dig down layer by layer. And I will tell you something really interesting as a total footnote. Midden is not recognized as a word in spelling bee. For those of you who play spelling bee from New York Times, I do every day. I love it. And they don't recognize midden, but midden is a real word, M-I-D-D-E-N. That's one of the ways archaeologists know historically what was actually happening. So we're now like, it's around like the year 1200 BCE, 1200 years before Jesus was born. But in Judaism, we say before the Common Era, BCE. And there were people living in the land then, and they were Canaanites. That was the land of Canaan. And the Torah also talks about the land of Canaan, like the Israelites arrived at the land of Canaan. We are nascent Jewish people, like we've been through Sinai at that point. We have Torah, we're a community, this is our mythic history. But anyway, then this settlement period happens where we go in. Oh, Liz, you said in the chat box, Canaanites, you are absolutely right. Canaan in Hebrew, that's right. So the Canaanites live there. They're, at that point, indigenous. They also came from somewhere and settled that land, as all people have come from somewhere and settled something. And the Israelites come along. And a really paradoxical part of our history, listen to this, is that in the Bible, our sages present the story as one of conquest. The Israelites moved in, conquered the Canaanites, like take the women and children too. It's very violent and very aggressive, and it's a kind of story of domination and basically kind of taking over the land. But guess what? When the archaeologists actually study that part of the world for that period of 1200 BCE to maybe 1000 BCE, there is no record of violence. It actually looks like what really happened was the Israelites assimilated in and had their practices, and the Canaanites had their practices, and there was influence on both sides. Most of the Israelite families had little hearth goddesses on their hearths, which was a ancient Middle Eastern worship the mother practice. And, the Canaanites were often influenced by the Israelites, and there was a lot of kind of sociological difference because if you think about it, the Israelites had been nomads for 40 years, herding sheep and goats, and we knew how to have a nomadic life. But when you got to Canaan, those people were farmers. So there was kind of some, clashing and learning, and the Israelites actually had to learn how to farm to survive, so they had to learn from the Canaanites. Anyway, there was no record of conquest. And when there's been a conquest, it's actually pretty obvious because you have a record, a historical archaeological record of burning and walls being crashed down and violence to skeletons and things. There's no record of that. So isn't that interesting? Let's go back to community view. I want to ask why you think our texts prevent a very violent story here of Jewish domination when that isn't actually what happened. What do you make of that? Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
Anybody have a hypothesis? Like, why would the people writing the history want to present a version of like, we're the victors, rah, rah?
Maybe they were just tired of being put down and being slaves, and this was their
Maybe it makes it sound.
mindset.
Thank you, Bobby. And was someone else?
No, I took care of it. It was
Oh, okay. One other thought? Anybody else have a thought? Evie?
To intimidate other people?
Yeah, I think both of those are really good ideas. Like back then, kind of might was right. You wanted to establish your right to the land. So it's like, write it down that we're the boss, we won. But that isn't what really happened. There were very friendly, peaceful relations. Then we know the story of King David and the temple gets built, and that's the center of Judaism. It's in Jerusalem. He's actually the third generation of people who had the temple. So we have our holy temple in Jerusalem, and that's it. What it means to be Jewish is to bring animals to sacrifice on a schedule, and it's all very organized. The priests run it, the Levites sing in it, the Cohens kind of pay tribute, and that's Judaism back then. There's no home Judaism. Synagogues don't yet exist. If you were Jewish, you'd make your pilgrimages 3 times a year. Everybody in your family go camp out in Jerusalem and bring your sacrifices of your best animals and your first fruits and all those things that we still mark in our sacred cycle of the year. And for 1,000 years, with one exception, that's what it meant to be Jewish. Judaism is 100% organized around the temple. And the one exception was in 586 BCE, the Babylonians took over the land of Israel and exiled the leaders of Judaism to Babylon. And this was a crisis for Judaism. How could we still be Jewish in exile? Why was that a crisis? Let's open it up here for a minute. Why was it a shocking crisis when the leaders of Judaism were exiled? The ordinary Jews stayed in the land of Palestine, but the leaders were exiled to Babylon, where we wept. You know the song, we lay down by the river of Babylon, and there we wept. By the waters of Babylon, die, 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 and there we wept for thee, Zion. And they carried us in captivity. It was very, very painful. So why was that a crisis for Judaism? in 586 BCE for those 50 years, starting then.
Carol, you're
Carol,
muted
you
if
can
you're
unmute if
speaking
you
to
want.
us.
Do you want to unmute? While Carol unmutes, anybody else want to speak to why that was a major crisis for Judaism?
I'm
They
thinking
didn't
maybe. Oh, go ahead.
they didn't have access to the temple and to Jerusalem in the foundation.
That's right. Everything Judaism had meant was no longer for those people in exile. But, you know, it was a crisis, but it was kind of a mini crisis because a generation later, everybody was allowed back in. A different superpower took over Babylonia and became the friend of the exiled Israelites. But the concept of exile lodged deeply in the Jewish psyche. That exile had been very painful, and it actually was a growth experience for Judaism, because it was right around then that theologically we began to have an idea of a more universal God, not just a God that dwells in this building called the Holy Temple in Jerusalem, but a God that could be our God anywhere we were in the world, and that was bigger even than just for the Jews. And that was kind of amazing. This crisis propelled the development of Judaism. But after 50 years, everybody got back into Israel. And guess what we did? We slowly but surely built the second temple. So we went right back to that 1,000-year period where the center of Judaism was Jerusalem. And it was the building, and it was the rhythm of the holy sacrifices and the whole thing. Okay, anybody have a comment on any of that? Comment or question? Meryl, you are on mute. Carol, were you able to unmute?
Oh, that was Carol.
That was Carol before, but we never.
Wow.
But
okay, am I unmuted?
yes,
Yes.
you are.
Okay. Well, I think that there were books that were written in Babylon. I think the Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud, I think was more accepted than the one in Jerusalem. And
Okay, Carol, that's later, but you're absolutely right. The Babylonian Talmud, it doesn't exist at this point in history, which is starting at 586 BCE. But eventually, you're right. The major version of the Talmud was written in exile in Babylonia.
yes.
So thank you for that.
That's more accepted than what happened in Jerusalem. Yeah. I also think that it was very courageous for the people to travel back from Babylonia to Jerusalem. It's like there were no buses or anything to get there.
Good point.
Using an animal, a
But
camel.
it's interesting that 50 years later, they still wanted to be in their home, which was,
right. But it was a trek. It was
they didn't want to go become Babylonian at that point, or just live there as a minority. They wanted to go back home to their land, and they did. So I think one thing that's really interesting is to look at how a major crisis historically can lead to the development of better things. Like Judaism became Judaism because of this bad crisis that happened to us back then. You know, it took a big quantum leap towards becoming the Judaism that we know. And that was what I said of it, you know, having to imagine a more universal God that wasn't just in a physical place addressing a tribe, basically. So, yeah. So anyway, after we were back in the land we now call Israel, Palestine, the temple was rebuilt. We have the second temple, and it goes on for hundreds of more years. The real devastation and the real challenge to that biblical way of being Jewish was in 70 CE, 70 of the Common Era, 70 after Jesus was born, but with the Jewish codification. We call it 70 of the Common Era, 70 CE. When the Romans, who had been ruling the land for a while, decided to destroy the second temple. They thought the Jews were like rebels and were making trouble, and they wanted to just make sure that their empire could be dominant. And the Jews were very divided at that time. We were divided into warring factions, and there were many ways you could think about that division, but there were the Sadducees, who were kind of the landed privileged gentry. They were one of the groups. There were the Pharisees, who you've read about in a negative context in the Christian scriptures, but actually they were what became rabbis. We would look at them very positively, the Pharisees. That was another group. And there were a couple other groups. There were the Samaritans were kind of a sect of Judaism that was pretty bizarre. There still are Samaritans in that land now. They have very different practices, but are Jewish, because they don't, I think still they don't accept the Talmud at all. So they're still being Jewish in a biblical way in some way. I don't really know how, because they don't have a temple. And then there were the Zealots. And the Zealots wanted to just sort of raise the whole thing, like burn it down, fight the Romans. And actually there was a fifth group of the Essenes, who just wanted to withdraw and be celibate, and kind of, that was where the Dead Sea Scrolls came from, that community, who didn't want to engage in politics, and they wanted to like fast, and they were like the Shakers. They didn't believe in having babies, so I guess they would have eventually died out anyway. But anyway, all these groups kind of had their space also in the temple, and they were fighting each other. And meanwhile, the Romans were trying to take over the entire thing and knock the temple down. And the temple was literally burning, and the Jewish subgroups were fighting each other. So I get, if you're paying attention to things happening today, there's some resonance, I think, on all of these, this full range of historical experience. So there we were in the burning temple, basically having civil war amongst the factions in the Jewish community, and the Romans are burning down the temple. We're in 70 CE. And a very dramatic story takes place. Yochanan ben Zakkai is in the temple. He's a Jewish teacher. He's a Pharisee. The idea of text study and learning and kind of teaching about Judaism was being invented in those years. And he said to his disciples, this is the end of this. This isn't going to work. We need to get out of here. Put me in a coffin and sneak me by the Roman guards. Say that your beloved Rebbe has died, and you have to leave the temple, the burning temple, to bury your Rebbe. And the disciples put Yochanan ben Zakkai into a coffin, and they go past the guards. They sneak him out of the burning temple. And they go to a place in the north of Israel called Yavne. And there they start, it's a remnant of Judaism. The temple's destroyed. There's no more temple. As you know, the one remaining vestige of it is the Western Wall, where people still go to pray. And the third most holy place in Islam, Al-Aqsa, is built right there, also on that same ground at this point. It's a very, very holy place. But there's no more temple. And to rebuild that temple would start World War III, because that's a shared holy site now. And Yochanan ben Zakkai goes to Yavne and starts a study center, basically, where they're going to reinvent Judaism. And they need to reinvent Judaism because they have no more temple. And the Romans have basically dispersed people, and especially a number of years later with the Bar Kokhba uprising, there's only the diaspora. There's always been a sort of a remnant of Jews who stayed in the Holy Land of Israel, Palestine. It never was that they were totally gone. But most Jews from then on lived in the diaspora. They went to Northern Africa, to Spain, to all sorts of all sorts of far-flung places, mostly in that part of the world still. So, what we would now call Syria, Iraq, Iran, all over there, and Northern Africa. There still are Jews in Northern Africa who are also pre-Talmudic. And I think in Patricia's Film Festival, the Jewish Film Festival in Philadelphia, there was a really interesting movie, I think, on the list this year about that community. Anyway, Jews were diaspora Jews from then on, and basically all the decisions about what it meant to be Jewish and how to be Jewish were going to be made with the idea that there's no longer a temple, that we have to figure this out. And that's what the Mishna came from. The Mishna is the discussions of the rabbis, starting after the destruction of the temple, about how are we going to be Jewish? How are we going to, what are we actually going to do to keep this being a people? It's very, very interesting. It's a little bit hard to understand if you just pick up the book and read it yourself. In a way, the most accessible part of it is Pirkei Avot, the part we're going to look at. But some of the other parts of the 6 books of the Mishnah, it's hard to just dive in because the rabbis are already in the middle of a discussion. And they start in sort of mid-flow of conversation. You're supposed to kind of already know a lot about what does their life look like and what are they even talking about. So it's I remember the first Mishnah as a rabbinical student I ever studied, when I just was not at all familiar with rabbinic language and it was very inscrutable, was they started with a conversation. I think it's the first Mishnah in the entire, and each little segment is called a Mishnah within the Mishnah. So the first Mishnah in the Mishnah was about what time do we say the Shema? And that assumes so much. It assumes that the people already were trying to say the Shema. They already had a practice of wanting to say the Shema, but now they need to know they don't have the temple where it was all organized by the time of the sacrifice. You knew when to say the Shema because you knew that there was a morning sacrifice and an afternoon and an evening and holy days. You knew what to do. And so how do you know now? There's no kind of marking for when to do what. And they have a big discussion about what time should we say the Shema? Should we say it at the dawn, when the dawn breaks? Should we say it when you can distinguish the color in your tallis? So you learn all these things about what they were already doing. And then they decide you should say the Shema when there's enough light to see your friend's face, which I love. And it just means it was kind of communal too. It was relational. So it's a beautiful thing, but it's kind of hard to just dive into it and know what they're talking about. So anyway, that is where the Mishnah came from. That's how it was situated. It's these people who are our early generations of rabbis, the earliest generations of rabbis, and they're taking over basically from who? Who was running Judaism before these rabbis started being rabbis and claiming some authority? Let's go back to community view and think about the centralization of the temple. Who was in charge of Judaism for all those 1,000 years of the temple? Who was making the decisions and running the thing? Drew.
Priest.
The great priest.
Yeah, well, there was the high priest, the Kohen HaGadol, and then there were all the Kohens, and the priestly class, they were the bosses. All of a sudden, there's no temple, so they don't have jobs anymore. Because literally the way they got fed, how did the priests eat? Literally, very concretely, how did they eat? They obviously weren't running farms like most people in the land were doing. They were growing crops or herding herds. The priests weren't doing that. They're working in the temple. So how did they eat? Eat.
Well, I'm assuming that whatever contributions from the Israelites were made to the temple would have been sufficient for them
Absolutely.
to
Right.
eat.
They were fed by the bounty of the land that was brought as gifts. And so all of a sudden, the Cohens have no economic base anymore. They have no jobs, right? They basically have a pretty unsustainable situation. And these rabbis, these emerging rabbis up in the north in Yavne, are like inventing Judaism. They're inventing home practices and laws, and that's where we get the Siddur from. Our prayer book starts evolving. I mean, we don't actually have a copy of a text till the 800s, but they were inventing it. And they're inventing like rules of like, when do you blow the shofar and who blows it? And they're inventing the idea of home Judaism. Like we can do Shabbat at home, not just in a building in Jerusalem. And all of these ideas, like they're inventing Judaism, and it's all in the Mishnah, and then it's in the Gemara, the rest of the Talmud. So there's a power struggle happening. Who is it between? They're not having a physical war, but what's going on here? It's a struggle for authority. Who's struggling with who?
Rabbi?
Yeah.
Hillel, the house of Hillel versus the house of Shammai?
Well, that was a struggle within the rabbis who were inventing the Mishnah. That both Hillel and Shammai are rabbis within the Mishnah tradition. But let's think about it again. The priests were hereditary, the Cohens. That's a hereditary class. They no longer have an economic base or a building or a job. But obviously they want to keep being priests. I mean, they want their power, right? And they had 1,000 years of authority. They were the power in Judaism. Nobody else could run Judaism. The priests ran it from the temple, with the high priest, the Kohen HaGadol, being really the head boss. So now there are these emerging rabbis who kind of debate back and forth, but then they agree on a consensus. Hillel and Shammai always fought each other, but they said it's for the sake of heaven. It's B'Shem Shemayim, and we're going to agree in the end and make a ruling for the Jewish people, which actually usually went with Hillel, the more lenient ruling. So they're actually, even though we think of them as polarized, they were within the same camp of the people creating the Mishnah. But there was a power struggle between these new rabbis, the emerging authorities, and who? Ain't it?
Well, I'm assuming with the Kohanim, but my question is, all right, these rabbis were in Yavna and then they were in the diaspora. What happened to the priests? Where did they actually go once the temple was destroyed?
Really good question, because that was hereditary, and we still know people named Cohen or Khan or
my own grandfather.
Yeah.
But
how many people here have Cohens in your lineage somehow, or any name like that? Sort of somewhere in there. Yeah. So I mean, if you know people with the last name Khan, Cohen, Katz even, and any variation on those things, the priest generations are still around and about. Some people take it very seriously and they get the first aliyah when you read Torah, but they no longer had power because you need an economic base, you need a constituency. They didn't have one at that point. But it was a time of great turmoil, struggle. It was a transition time. And basically, we are the inheritors of rabbinic Judaism, if you think about it. What we think of as Judaism was invented by those rabbis starting at Yavne and continuing on for hundreds of years, like 600 years probably. So we would not recognize what it meant to be Jewish for those 1,000 years of biblical Judaism centered around the temple. It would be completely alien to us. The idea of taking your animal to sacrifice being the essence of Judaism. That just is not what it would not look Jewish to us. We are the inheritors of 2,000 years of rabbinic creation of Judaism, which is basically a diaspora creation. Rabbinic Judaism is basically diaspora Judaism. It wasn't invented in the Holy Land. So I think it's really important to study this piece of history right now, because I maintain we're in a different tumultuous passage in Judaism with huge questions on our plate right now about what the future of Judaism will look like. And this is very informative to learn about this transformation of Judaism in a very successful way. Like, we like having inherited rabbinic Judaism. We like Shabbat. We like learning like we're doing now, which is a practice of rabbinic Judaism, text study, the idea of synagogues and community building in the diaspora, not just in one temple, meaning like the one and only temple, like in Jerusalem, like that ancient building. That's not our kind of Judaism now. We have temples. And in fact, Reform Judaism named temples to refer back to that this is the replacement of that one and only building in Jerusalem. But we're going to have it all over the place. And, it's going to be local communities all through the diaspora. So it's really important.
Rabbi Julie, Bobby has her hand up.
Okay, can we go to community view?
Yep.
Yeah.
Rabbi, my question is, when they fled to Yavne, how about the ordinary people who were living around the temple? Like, what happened to the day-to-day people while all of this was,
That's such a good question, Bobby. And really, the rabbis who fled to Yavne and had a learning center there, they were the elite. They were people who were leaders and who could do it. They are the ones who created rabbinic Judaism that we inherit. Many, many years later, reconstructing Judaism leaders like Mordechai Kaplan asked the question you're asking. What happened? What were the folk doing back then? He was very interested because he also came of age at a time when anthropology was being invented, which was asking all around the world, what are people's lives like? And he asked the question, what were the non-elite doing? And the feminists have asked, what were the women doing? Because we weren't at Yavne. We weren't getting to be the rabbis designing Judaism. And so we've gone back in and, pulled up more resource from what the folk were doing. But rabbinic Judaism was invented by the elite. And I think it's a really interesting question. How did they disseminate it? That's a really interesting question. And somehow people were hungry for leadership. There were no more priests in positions of power because there was no temple. There was no economic base for them. They couldn't be fed. And so the Jewish people started turning to the rabbis to say, how do we do this? How do we do that? And they would bring questions to Yavne and the rabbis ruled. So it was very mutual. The people wanted leadership. The leaders wanted to be the decision makers. Some things were left out at that time, such as the women, and had to be kind of sourced, I think, in a more modern era. But anyway, I want to move into the actual text here.
I'm just going to interrupt you. I'm going to interrupt you one more time. Ed, I saw that you had your hand up earlier. Did you have?
Can we go to community view?
Thank you. Rabbi, I just wanted to clarify that the settlement of Yava privileged the Pharisees over the Sadducees, over the priestly class, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. The Pharisees were the learned people in the society who were not landowners. They basically were like artisans and city dwellers, and they were not the Sadducees. So at that time, there's a huge power struggle, like huge upheaval. Yes. So the Pharisees always had to work to support themselves. It's not like today when the Israeli government supports the yeshiva buchlers to go learn all day long in yeshiva. They were mostly artisans of some kind or other, and they studied tons of Torah, and they met with each other and designed this whole thing. And it was all oral. It was still oral in those early 200 years of Mishnah. They would chant it to each other, and they had people whose job it was to memorize it and chant the oral tradition. It wasn't written yet. It was written down in about 200 CE. Somebody, Judah Hanasi, codified it, and kind of, then it was formal and never changed again. Until then, it was an oral tradition. But I want to actually get to the text. Does everybody?
I'm sorry to interrupt you one more time.
Okay.
Enid is trying to break in as well.
Okay, Enid, short comment. Can we go to community view?
Yeah, no, I just have a question because I'm listening, and so therefore the Mishnah was the written law, the writing of what had been the oral law before. In other words,
not the oral law of the Torah, which is never written. It's the oral discussions that the rabbis were having about how to be Jewish after the destruction of the temple. And it was written down a couple hundred years later. It was oral till then. So it's different from the oral Torah, which is.
No, I understand it, but I've just grown up with the idea that the Mishnah was the written codification of what had been oral prior to that. So if I hear you,
You're right that it was the oral discussions of those rabbis starting at Yavneh that got written down, and they had discussions a little bit earlier than that. Like they already had started the process of, kind of thinking about all this before the destruction of the temple. So it was about 200 years, but a little bit before the destruction. Like Hillel and Shammai are both before the destruction of the temple. They're more.
Okay. But what, and I may be going a little ahead and I apologize, but what is the Gemara then?
So after the Mishnah is completed, rabbis continued discussing it all and parsing it, because it's sort of like you have a constitution, like the Torah is the constitution, but conditions change. And there's all sorts of contemporary issues that need more understanding and rulings and whatever. And so that's the Mishnah did that for one stage, and then the Gemara does it for the next stage for 400 more years, and then that's codified too, and you have the Talmud.
Right, thank you.
Okay, so let's turn to your handout. Does everybody have that?
I think I may have been remiss in sending that out.
Oh, really? But I think people did at some point get the.
Yeah.
Because I remember Wendy saying it was very interesting. So Wendy must have read it. Well, I can put it in the chat box, I think, right now. It's for anybody who can use the chat box. But we will read it out loud also. I know not everybody can use the chat box, but
I'm happy to send it out after.
Okay.
So they were published in this week. Thank you, Ed.
Yeah, I think people did get it because I've heard a few comments. But here it is again, I think, if you can click through to that in the chat box. Can somebody read us the first Mishnah that we're looking at? It's the first Mishnah in Pirkei Avot. Can anybody read that in English to us? You have it in English and Hebrew. Do we have a volunteer? Okay, Ed, go for it.
Moses received the Torah from Sinai and transmitted it to Yehoshua, and Yehoshua to the elders, and the elders to the prophets, and the prophets transmitted it to the men of the great assembly. They said 3 things: be deliberate in judgment, raise up many disciples, and make a fence for the Torah.
Wonderful. Okay, we're going to really break that down and understand it. I will just say, as we begin to understand it, that the men of the great assembly were rabbis. It was like a congress of rabbis. So let's parse this out. Moshe, this is a chain of succession, right? That's what you see here in the very first Mishnah. It's a way of these rabbis establishing authority. So let's look at how they're doing that. They are proclaiming their lineage of authority. Why do they get to decide what Judaism is? They're going to tell us right here in the very first Mishnah, Pirkei Avot 1:1. Okay, so Moshe. Moshe's kind of a mythical Jewish biblical figure from, we would say, about like 1200 BCE, so way before the temple was even built, way back. And where did Moshe get the Torah from, folks? Bobby, let's stay on community view for this, so everybody, I can't see people's hands. Where did Moshe get the right to tell people what's in the Torah in our mythic history? Everybody knows, but some people are saying it, but you're on mute. Okay, Moses got it from Mount Sinai in our mythic history, right? So you really can't go back farther than that, right? Like that's the beginning. That's when the Torah is given. So if you say it started with Moses handing it down, you're telling an origin story. Okay, so Moses, what this mission is proclaiming is, we rabbis go back to Moses at Mount Sinai. Okay, starting with Moses at Sinai, he got the Torah. And who did he give it to? Yehoshua is Joshua. And Joshua is the person who led the crossing of the Jordan River, knocked down the walls of Jericho when they're first entering the land of Canaan. So what is this telling us? Moses gave the sacred teaching to this next generation, Joshua. What does that tell us? There's no wrong answers here. Like, what is trying to be established here? Like, from the minute the people entered this holy land, Joshua's the next leader who's mentioned in the Bible. And also, it's from the first moment in the Holy Land, Joshua had this sacred teaching. Moses got it at Sinai. Moses gave it to Joshua, who led us into this settlement period. And then who did Joshua give it to? He gave it to the elders, okay? And to the elders gave it to the prophets. Why do we need to have the prophets mentioned in here? Because in the Bible, yeah, I can't see who's talking, but
yeah, they were direct lineage to God, the prophets.
Yes, and the prophets are they're very biblical. Mm-hmm. So they're kind of a very big piece of the origin story. They're in direct communication with God, and they're part of a triangle. There's the kings, there's the prophets, and there's the priests. Well, after this exile and everyone's dispersed, there's no more Jewish kings, so it doesn't really matter to get your authority from them. Obviously, you can't get your authority as rabbis from the priests, right? Because that's your biggest contender. So what's left? The prophets. So you want to link your lineage. This is a sort of like they are contesting for power here in this very first Mishnah. They're telling a story of why they should have the right to have authority. And as you can see, they're just stating it like, well, this is the way it works. This is the facts. This is how we do it. But we who understand the history of it all understand that they were in a very fragile, tenuous position. Like they actually weren't the authorities in Judaism at that time. And they're creating this story to say, well, here's how it works. We go back to Sinai, and then we go to the prophet, we go to Joshua, we go to the prophets. So when you kind of parse this out, there's a really deeper story being told here than just what it looks like. So the prophets. And then the men of the Great Assembly were the decision makers at what's called the Sanhedrin during that early part of post-Jesus. They're kind of like during temple times and after, they're supposed to be the decision makers, but soon there's nobody left in the land. But for a while, there's people in the land until the Akiba uprising, when everybody's really out of the land. And the men of the Great Assembly, no one knows if it ever really existed, but it was rabbis who made decisions, supposedly. And the men of the Great Assembly, in this telling of the story, hand their power down to these rabbis who are creating the Mishnah. So what do you think about all that? Anne? Can you unmute, Ann?
Yeah, just did.
Okay, good.
That is how power passes.
Yeah.
That I decide, or my group decides, we're in power. And if somebody says, no, you're not, yeah, we are. And you know why? Because God told us.
Yeah.
And Bill and I were just discussing that. It's kind of like the history of the Catholic Church. God appointed St. Peter appointed the Pope, and there will be no further discussion about it. But there's a similarity of we decide.
Yeah.
Because God told us.
Right. And when you really look at it with some perspective, it is a narrative, and there could be a different narrative. And I think today, when we think about Trump just proclaiming a narrative, that doesn't make it true. Just because you proclaim something, it doesn't make it truth. And, you have to sort of believe in yourself. These rabbis really believed in themselves. Like, they are just creating out of thin air the future of Judaism, and they succeeded. And it's kind of a beautiful, powerful story.
But it's, pardon the pun, it's very prophetic.
Yeah.
It's
really
incredible when you think 2,000 years ago.
That's right. They created out of nothing. Yeah. So, anybody else want to comment on our first Mishnah here? Any other thoughts about that? And does it make sense that they're just inventing a lineage and they're kind of claiming this transmission line that looks pretty powerful? Wouldn't you want to root your authority back at Sinai? That's pretty cool. And then you also are rooting it in God's prophetic transmission. I mean, it's pretty cool.
Well, how did they know that there was a Sinai, that there was a Moses? So there were already stories and already transmissions of information around.
Okay. They had the Bible by then. The Bible was codified. The Torah was codified around 400 BCE when they got back from exile. And they decided, we're really worried that this is fragile, and now we've been in exile. We need to write it all down. So that's when Ezra and everybody, it was kind of a conservative move in a way, because until then it was pretty fluid. It was an oral tradition, and it was basically set, but it did have variations in different places, and it sort of evolved. But now it was going to be written down for the first time by scribes on parchment. So these people, who are a few hundred years later, they already had the Bible. So they kind of know the mythic Jewish history. But they would have known it anyway from the oral chanting tradition, because it already was an oral tradition that was chanted. And a lot of people knew it by heart. Because if you think about a pre-literate society, a lot of things are oral. They're tapped in. A lot of people carry those things with them. So they knew the whole mythic history, and they're building out from there. But really good question. Like, how do they even know what to build from? They're just inventing it out of thin air, but they're building it on what they knew at the time. Bobby with an E.
Following all these periods in history is kind of, difficult, but I'm trying to imagine people going to the temple, sacrificing their animals. And I imagine at that time that it was mainly kind of pleading to God that we would have rain and successful harvests and all this. But did they at that time, even during the time of the temple before Yavne, did they have the concepts of ethics and besides animal sacrifice? Were they...
Bobby, perfect segue into our next Mishnah. So if you're looking at the text, look at your next Mishnah, which is Pirkey Avot, chapter 1, number 2 on your sheet. They're putting some values in here now. Okay, they already established their lineage of authority in the very first Mishnah. We got that. Now, in the second Mishnah, they start to put values into it. Now, during the temple time, it's true, people would pray from the heart for fertility or for this or that as they sacrificed their animals. There was tithing and there was, all those kind of things. But more the ethical part of Judaism built out after the destruction of the temple. And here we're going to see it in this Mishnah. So does somebody want to read us Mishnah number 2 here? Do we have a reader for Mishnah number 2? Okay, Phil, I think you have your hand up. Is that true? No, not Phil. Okay.
Okay, I'll read it.
Thank you, Liz.
Pirkey Avot. Shimon the righteous was from the remnants of the great assembly. He would say, on 3 things the world stands, on the Torah, on the service, and on acts of loving kindness.
Beautiful. So we would say that the world stands on the Torah, meaning all learning, all kinds of lifelong learning, on work, like service, what we do to build the world, and on acts of caring. So now they're adding ethics into their teaching very early on in the Mishnah. They're adding these ethical values. I want to actually point out a word in Hebrew here, because the great assembly in Hebrew is called Knesset Hagdolah. And does the word Knesset ring a bell?
Of course.
Yeah. So the Knesset, that's where it chose its name from, was this, language in the Mishnah. That this is it was already called the Knesset Hagdolah, but when the Mishnah wrote it down, that was its name. This great assembly. So that's where the current Knesset got its name from, that language. So we start getting ethical teachings in here. And as we go through it, we're going to see lots of other kinds of teachings too. But that was a good question, Bobby. Like, where do the values and the ethics come in? And we're going to see that play out. So it's practices, ethics, it's how to be Jewish, the full range of what it means to be Jewish. Now, in the assignment for this class, I asked people to start gathering up wisdom statements that you carry with you, maybe from your family or something that's especially meaningful to you that you learned somewhere else. And I would like to hear some of them. And we're going to be doing this at the end of every class to hear some of our own wisdoms. You can even write your own, but there's so many good ones that are out there. Okay, Susan Milner, you can unmute.
I remember to thine own self be true.
Oh, I love that. And where did you learn that?
From my father.
Wow, that's beautiful. Do you know where he learned it?
I don't. I just remember his stating it in when we had some private conversations about maybe struggles I was having, and we were close, and that was just a dominant theme for me.
That's great. Like, be yourself in this world. Yeah, I love it. Okay, who else?
And I was going to say, he practiced, he stood behind that at different periods when I had to make hard decisions. So he didn't take decision-making from me. He just supported my making my decisions.
He practiced what he preached. Somebody else got one. Thank you, Susan. Evie.
I heard from my father, good, better, best. Never let it rest till your good is better and your better is best.
Wow, I love that. That's so great. I remember when I was a very young rabbi, my father asked, are you nervous when you get up there? And I said, oh yeah, like I'll give a sermon, and I always like critique it afterwards and, wonder if it was good and did the message really get across and does it matter and all those things. And he said, I think it's really good to have some doubts because that's what makes you better. So that was really, yeah, I love that, Evie.
Diane just wrote a great one into the chat.
Oh, Diane. Okay. Where'd you get, is that your own or did you learn it somewhere?
Wasn't it Bobby McFerrin?
Yep.
Oh my, yeah, people can get these from songs, from poetry. I think a really important one to a lot of people is the serenity prayer. Give me the serenity to accept what I have to accept, the courage to change what I can change, and the wisdom to know the difference. I love that. I could live life by that, that's powerful wisdom. Wait, let's hear anybody who hasn't gone yet have one that you want to share. Fran.
My grandmother, my mother's mother, would say, the world is at the tip of your tongue.
What did she mean by that?
Meaning that you can create by your words. You can ask questions, you can assert yourself, and there's no limit to it. That's what I assume so. That's what my mom said to me, and she's sitting right here beside me. I don't know if
my
you can,
goodness. Well, that's
you
a very
can see her.
idea. That's a very Jewish idea, the power of words, and don't do lashon hara speech,
Right.
Like don't tear people down behind their backs or to their faces. Yeah. Like build.
And also, she did not have any vision. She was not a sighted person.
Wow.
So I think that informed her philosophy too.
Wow. Susan Milner's put in, do what you can with what you have where you are. Teddy Roosevelt. And the corollary to that is the famous organizer, Harvard professor Marshall Gans, who says organizing is to partner with people to start with what they have, to get what they need, to get what they want.
And Kate put one in the chat as well. Add your light to the sum of light. And that's from Tolstoy.
That's beautiful. I love that, because that kind of communicates it's bigger than you do your bit. Which is kind of also a very Jewish idea that, everybody doing your mitzvahs, your good deeds adds up to be a good world that reflects.
And also as a political activist, I feel like I don't look for my own, necessarily the rewards of my own action. I just am participating with everybody else towards a goal. It's not personal. It's you're part of a group.
It's for the common good. Yeah. That's fantastic. Okay, let's have a couple more. Beverly, you can unmute.
Here, I'll send you a link, Beverly.
My father would say, never a borrower or a lender be.
Oh, wow. Did you take it to heart?
Well, I borrowed something from a friend, and I had a little accident with it, and that's when my father said, neither a borrower nor a lender be.
Wow. Okay. Did anybody inherit sort of a so-called wisdom statement that you disagree with, that you've kind of come to see wasn't actually really helpful? Like, I'm thinking of things like kids should be seen and not heard, which was a very tried and true one. So not everything that's handed down is necessarily going to be something you take to heart. So I wonder if anybody else has something that wasn't ultimately what you wanted to carry in your heart. Oh, okay. Well, over these weeks, I hope people will continue to gather up your own wisdom statements or invent them. If you're going to make one up, because we'll have some more weeks. Now, let's make a space for questions about any or all of this. And then we are going to, have some announcements, and we're going to conclude with our Torah learning song. But let's have a space for any questions. And let me just see if yeah, good. Anybody have any questions either about the Mishnas that we studied, those two texts that we went through today, or just about the overall review of the history? Would it be helpful? I know Bobby said it's hard to keep the historical eras in mind. Would it be helpful to just have me quickly, in a nutshell, review those eras one more time? Yeah? Okay. So Exodus from Egypt, about 1200 BCE. 40 years later, coming into the land of promise. What's called the settlement period, They're coming into Canaan. The Canaanites live there. And by 1000, King David is the king, and there's a temple. And he's the third generation where there was a temple. So it's Solomon builds it. It's so there's 3 generations, and it's an easy date. Like David was his historical figure. He's around about 1000 BCE. And the next 1000 years is considered biblical history. So that's when people are living biblical Judaism centered around the temple. So that's 1000 BCE up till 70 CE, so until the destruction of the second temple. We do know there's a 50-year break in that when the Babylonian exile happened and the first temple was destroyed. But basically, it's 1000 years of biblical Judaism centered around a building called the temple, except for those 50 years of early exile. In 70 CE, the Romans take over, they destroy the temple. That's the second temple. That's where we get the Western Wall from. There's still Jews around and about in certain numbers until 137 CE, when the Rabbi Akiva uprising is squashed by the Romans, and pretty much everybody, except for a tiny remnant that always was Jewish in that land, but most Jews no longer live in that land of Israel, Palestine. Judaism becomes a pretty much 100% diaspora religion, even though there's always a few Jewish people who are still living there. The Jews are never gone totally from Israel, Palestine after the settlement period, which to me is important, because to me it means that in that land, Jews are indigenous, Palestinians are indigenous. We've all got to learn to live together. We share a land we all love there. And, you know, there is a big period of sort of imperialism and colonialism and settlement that happens in the 19th century and early 20th century. That is also true, but it's not that the Jews aren't indigenous. The Jews are indigenous, and a colonization period happened connected to Western European history. That's really for a different day. But anyway, so big sweep of history. The temple was destroyed in 70 CE, 70 years after the birth of Jesus. And that was the second temple being destroyed by the Romans. About a generation later, most of the Jews are exiled, and Judaism from then on is developed basically in the diaspora. It's diaspora Judaism. We are the inheritors of diaspora Judaism. Okay, Meryl?
Wait a minute. Am I unmuted? Wait a minute.
Yes, you're good.
Okay. I think that one of the things we talked about as a Hebrew school teacher was when the diaspora happened, the people in these temples had like guest houses where like you could live with people in the diaspora, like that's how the congregations got started, as guest houses for like congregations of Jews that kind of gravitated to each other. So like the original temples from the diaspora were like guest houses, and like a bunch of Jewish people would live together and learn together.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you. Yeah. And Fran's asking, where is Yavneh? Yavneh in English, Yavneh. It's in the northern part of Israel. It's probably still on a map. Someone should look. I mean, I think it probably would be. You can get these biblical atlases where they layer each historical period over the land of Israel, Palestine, and I love those. If we were in person, I'd be passing one around right now. They're very cool. Each page is a different layer of history and what it looked like. But anyway, okay, announcements, and then we will have our closing Torah learning song.
Great. Yep, it's wonderful to see all of you. And we have a lot going on. And I want to welcome Kate with us for the first time. And I want to say hello to Joan Shore, who I see sitting in the background there. It's so nice to see you. Okay, so Seder's coming up pretty soon, 2 weeks from tonight, I think. Yes, 2 weeks from tonight. You can still register, but registration deadline is this Wednesday, April 2nd. So you can look for that online. Some of you have flyers. If you need help with it, reach out to us by email or by phone, so we can proceed smoothly. And we look forward to having many of you with us for the Seder.
How much is the check that we should write?
$54.
Okay.
Well, that's the price of the Seder. Some people are adding some to that to enable others to attend. That's up to you.
Okay.
And I will say that if you want to pay by check, please at this point do not put it in the mail. Or if you're going to put it in the mail, let me know that you're putting it in the mail so I can expect it, because the mail is, as we know, pretty unreliable. And if you mail it today, we may not get it till after the Seder, but that's okay as long as we know. All right, so that's kind of the deal with that. Then the night after the Seder, we have council on the 14th. And the next session for Rabbi's education class on this same topic, the wisdom of the ancestors, will be Sunday, April 20. I want to announce that there will be a different Zoom link for that class. So just keep checking your emails. You will get the correct link in email. But we have to change it for that class because I can't be there.
And you'll get it on that day, right, Bobby? It'll be right in at the top of your box on that day.
It'll be, yeah, it'll come out the day before and then again that morning, like we usually do.
Great.
Okay, book group. We're reading The Immortalists by Chloe Benjamin, and our discussion will be on the 28th of April. We have 2 Rosh Chodeshes, one on the 2nd of April and one on the 30th of April. So watch out for that. And our next Shabbat morning service, I'm doing this out of order, is Saturday morning, next Saturday, April 5th, led by Michael Mekaton. And I will leave it at that. And I guess I will wish all of you a Zis Pesach, a sweet Pesach, if I don't see you then.
For our teachers and our students and the students of our students, we ask for peace and loving kindness, and let us say Amen. We ask for peace and loving kindness, and let us say Amen. We ask for peace and loving kindness, and let us say Amen. Thank you all for coming. It's wonderful to be here together, and there will be a recording for anyone who wants to watch it.
Thank you, Rabbi Julie.
Thank you. It was very good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That was so interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you.